This is episode 194, and you listening to the Conservation and Science podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics like ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. And I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and I always strive to bring you diverse perspectives on every environmental story that I cover. And you know what? This episode is pretty special to me because our guest today is somewhat of a personal hero of mine. Our guest is Jude Isabella, who is an author, a leading Canadian nature journalist, and founder and editor-in-chief of Hakai Magazine. Of course, you might know that last year we were hit by the very sad news that Hakai Magazine is closing, and everybody cried, and it was a very sad moment. But there were good news. We were recording that episode late last year, and we were just not in a position, or more specifically, Jude was not in a position to share the good news. But since we're publishing this episode in January, the good news are already out. Hakai Magazine will continue. Their team is joining with Biographic, and Biographic is another free, independent nature magazine. So they will continue their work together. They joined forces, basically. So I really look forward for more articles and more excellent nature journalism that is coming now under the banner of Biographic. This episode was inspired by the article that appeared in Hakai Magazine titled "Where the Rivers Run Pink." And the article is about invasive pink salmon. It's a Pacific species of salmon that is showing up in quite big numbers right now in Norwegian rivers. Subject is somewhat relevant because pink salmon is also showing up in Scottish River. It is also showing up in Irish rivers. So it is interesting to hear how Norwegians, who got them much earlier than we are here, how they're dealing with this problem. And maybe we need to ask ourselves the question whether this is a problem at all. And obviously, you should read the article. The link is in the description of the show, as always. But in this episode, we're not simply just reiterating what was already written in the article. We're diving deeper into certain aspects and certain issues described in an article. And as always, in those cases, we getting into some stories that didn't quite make into the article. As you know, even if you have editorial freedom, some stuff just is not making into the piece that you're writing because you're trying to make that piece focused and consistent. So some stuff is not making into the article. So in this episode, you will have an opportunity to hear about all the stories that you cannot read in the article. So I think this is enough of this introduction. You have a pretty good idea what we are going to talk about. And just a reminder, as always, look in the description of this show. You have links there to my newsletter, and you have a link to the article that we are talking about, where the rivers run pink. And obviously, you also have links to my social media, although I'm using them less. Not the links, the social media I'm using less. So anyway, folks, enjoy this episode. Jude, welcome to the show. It is absolute honor to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
Listen, before we jump into the subject of pink salmon, you are the founder and editor-in-chief of Hakai Magazine. I don't know whether there are any listeners to this podcast that don't know Hakai Magazine. Perhaps they are. Can you tell us what inspired you to create Hakai Magazine? And more importantly, the current status where we are with Hakai Magazine.
Yes, and interestingly, what inspired Hakai Magazine was a book I was writing about salmon, Pacific salmon, on the coast of Canada. I started that book maybe 2010, 2011. I did a lot of field trips with scientists from various universities on the coast of British Columbia. And so I'd be out hiking along salmon streams, and I'd be out with archaeologists, sifting through fish bones. I was everywhere on the coast. And while I was while I was working on that book, I met the founders of the Tula Foundation, Eric Peterson and Christina Monk, and they were very interested in supporting journalism in general. Eric, especially, both of them actually, science journalism. Science journalism and journalism in general has taken a real hit in Canada over the last, couple of decades with the internet. And they were interested in starting something that was focused on science, the environment, that kind of thing. And they had just started the Hakai Institute as well. And the Institute was busy starting to work with a lot of the scientists I was actually interviewing. So it just kind of became this synergistic kind of thing. And Eric, one day we're chatting about journalism in Canada and the closing of certain magazines and stuff. And he said, let's start our own rag. I said, okay, if you're serious. And it just seemed like a good fit to create a magazine that was focused on coasts and oceans, because that's what Hakai Institute did. That was clearly a focus of the Tula Foundation, and nobody actually is on that beat or was on that beat. And we are still the only ones, as far as I know, in journalism, independent journalism, on that beat. So Eric and Christina, when I put together a proposal with a friend of mine, Dave Garrison, who I've worked with now for over 20 years. I worked for him at another magazine years ago, starting like over 20 years ago. And we make a good team. We have a different skill set that works together very well. And we put together this proposal, and they said, like, within hours, they said, yes, let's do it. And they've been extremely supportive for 10 years. But the Tula Foundation needs to move forward. They need to be sustainable. They have some other programs that are super important. Like one nobody knows about called Tula Salud, which is focused on mothers and babes in Guatemala. It's been an incredible initiative since, I think, 2001 or so, their first one. They've made a huge impact on the health of that population in Guatemala, right? I mean, it's pretty astonishing. So they have things like that need to keep moving forward and be sustainable. So that's why at the end of this year, they told us in June, we just can't keep going with this. They've been our sole funder. Again, incredibly generous. Our independence, they've been incredibly generous with independence, never interfered with anything we've done. Just have been excited from the start about how we've built this publication into what it's become. And we've had so much success in terms of syndicating to some of those big legacy publications, in terms of gathering readers and an audience, in terms of the stories we've done and the scientists who want to be in our pages, who contact us and go, I'm trying so hard to get my research done, so maybe it piques your interest, that kind of thing. So building on that momentum, we do have a plan for 2025 that I can't reveal yet, and I really wish I could. Maybe later I can contact you and tell you what it is.
But I would love to.
Yeah, we're in talks, and it looks like we had a plan A, B, and C, and it looks like plan A is going to go ahead for January. So, all toes are crossed, and we hope.
Fingers crossed, because, both I and some people I follow on Twitter was like, oh my God, no, it is closing, because we saw like a tweet from Hakai Magazine that we no longer keep going. So, oh no, it was like a very sad moment. But I'm glad that it seems like some good news are coming, and maybe by the time this episode is out, those news will be out as well. In which case, I will probably add some extra information to the episode.
Excellent,
fantastic. Okay, Jude, thank you for that introduction. Now I think that all people know, and I also noticed that the website Hakai Magazine will be still maintained. So definitely, whoever listened to that, and if you're not familiar with Hakai Magazine, go in there, and there's like tons and tons and tons of interesting articles with videos embedded and stuff like that. And today, we are here to specifically talk about the issue that was described in detail in one of the articles in Hakai Magazine, and that is the pink salmon in Norwegian rivers. Tell me, like, what drew your interest to this particular topic?
Well, as you know, I wrote a book about salmon called Salmon, a Scientific Memoir, which is about Pacific salmon off the coast of North America, Russia, Japan. And I happened, I'm interested in salmon. And I happened to see a scientific publication, a scientific paper about foxes eating pink salmon carcasses in Norway's eastern province, Finnmark. And I thought, well, that's interesting because I've written about wolves on the coast here eating salmon. I think the first time I wrote about it was over 20 years ago for a kids magazine I edited. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. This is potentially ecologically huge, right? So I knew it would be a good news story. So I contacted the scientist, Kathy Dunlap, in Norway at the Marine Institute there. And I had a great conversation with her, and I thought, and she told me a lot of the background. And so her paper was about, I think it was a 2021 paper, and Norway had experienced this influx of pink salmon in 2017. So I got this background from her, and I thought, okay, this is more than a news piece. This is a feature. And I put together a proposal to my editorial team, and with a photographer, videographer, Kat Pine, who's on our staff, and proposed to go to Finnmark and check out what was happening there.
How long you guys been there?
We were there for 3 weeks.
Okay.
A good chunk of time to see what was going on and talk to a lot of people. So much did not get in that article.
I can imagine. But when I was reading that article, it was like, wow, it felt like you were there at least 6 months.
Thank you.
It was so much interesting. Tell us, I just wanted, like, how did it feel? How, like, paint us a picture, like when you were standing there on the Grense Jakobselv River. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes.
Right? So it's a border between Norway and Russia. Ooh, like, was it dodgy? Like, was it beautiful? Like, what did you feel there?
It was beautiful. It's interesting because you go up this dirt road, and on the side, and on one side, so the river's on the left side if you're going up the dirt road towards some of the sites, the sites where they snorkel and where they do the first kind of sampling, and then they work their way down the river toward the estuary. And on the right side is a fence. It's all fenced there. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. It's fenced there. And it's fenced there so that the reindeer, because the reindeer are domesticated, the Sami herd them. So the reindeer don't go into Russia because that's not allowed, right? But
is it reindeer not allowed, or that the people then going to pick the reindeer not allowed?
Both. Nobody's allowed, but they don't even want domesticated animals. Fair enough, wandering over. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. And then you have this whole other area. It's not really huge strip of land, but it's there's birch trees, there's ferns, there's heathers. It's very green. I mean, I was there in July. The river was a little bit low then, but still, it as I said in the article, it just oozes life, it pulses life, because there's just not a lot of people there. A lot of people fish the Grense Jakobselv, and I ran into fishers coming to do that, to fly fish, but there's nobody on the other side. There's Russian soldier border guards there, and occasionally we saw a few on quads and presumably peering at us. But it was, I don't want to say it was surreal, because it's just a beautiful part of, it's a beautiful ecosystem. And when you're there with the fish, there wasn't many fish when we first got there, but a lot more when I was there 3 weeks later. The fish, the moose, the birds, it was, the burbling of the water, the smell of the air, with the birch sap dripping, that sweet, sweet smell. It's like you're just ensconced in Mother Nature's arms in a way. It's really quite beautiful. I didn't feel kind of, oh my God, the Russians are over there. I didn't feel that way actually at all. But it is interesting because there's that juxtaposition: fence, Norwegian soldiers, a Norwegian police escort, who was actually just an intern. She was a sweet young woman. So it's kind of like, and I swear all the Norwegian soldiers must get some kind of training about dealing with tourists or civilians or whatever. So they're very lovely and sweet and chatty and happy to have their pictures taken. So, but at the same time, they're at this border, which probably has a lot of tension that I didn't feel because I was writing about fish. Unlike Ben Taub, I don't know if you saw the article in the New Yorker, was writing about Russian espionage in Finnmark, exactly where I was.
Yeah, well, that's no doubt. There's many layers of things that are going on that sort of outsiders are not aware, or at least not immediately aware. There was one thing I just when you said about the anglers who go fishing there, my immediate thought was, and I think it was a piece in the article, it was a part of it, like if your hook or your lure get entangled on the Russian side, that's go, oh my God, my expensive lure.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I knew that because one of the scientists I was in the field with, he had been there fishing with his son a number of years ago. And that happened to his son. He was fly fishing, his lure went flying, and then they're just horrified because here's this fishing line in the heather on the other side of the border. And it's, I think they eventually got it out, but he was interesting because he said, I didn't know what to do. You can't go and get it. You can't go past that border. And the thing is that border changes because the border is where the river is the deepest. And every 5 years, I think, they kind of resurvey it, and then the GPS points change.
Oh, okay. That is interesting. Okay, let's get into the thick of it. So the whole story begins with Soviet Union, I think, in 1956. They brought the pink salmon. Not many good things came out of Soviet Union. That's one of them. It's not a political podcast, but so can you tell us, like, what was the motivation? Like, why they brought a Pacific species into the White Sea?
Well, you can't really blame the Soviets because Canada was doing it, and the U.S. was doing it as well. And, Japan was heavy into hatcheries and stuff like that. I mean, Canada and the U.S. worked really hard to send Pacific salmon into other ecosystems. I think there's actually a viable Chinook run in New Zealand. There's some viable runs in Chile. So it was something scientists all over were moving fish around, especially salmon, because they were so prolific. Right? They were a great resource. At that time, we didn't have a lot of those catastrophic failures of salmon runs, right? There was these massive biomass just coming up rivers, providing food for people. So in their head, it's just like more fish for people, more food source. So Canada and the U.S. did the same. There's Pacific salmon in the Great Lakes, for instance. There's a few populations there that have done quite well. But in the U.S. and Canada, they were also bringing fish from the East Coast to the West Coast, right? Like, and bivalves and whatever. This was something everybody was doing, not just the Soviets. So for the Soviets, it was a food source. It was a potentially really good food source. And they tried, and this is in a remote area, probably poor, and it was already suffering some ecosystem degradation from from mismanagement over the years, from industrialization, as happened post, 1850s, whatever, post-industrialization, trawling, all that kind of stuff. We started mucking about with fisheries a very long time ago. So, rightfully, they were like, okay, can we provide this food source? And I think their original stocks came from Sakhalin Islands. And they played with those for a while, and they never really had a lot of luck. And it wasn't until 1985 where they took some fish from, I think it's called the Ola River, and it's on the mainland in eastern Russia. And they managed to create a self-sustaining population for the White Sea. And really, they were spectacularly successful. So in a way, they were successful in a way other countries weren't. The Soviet scientists. And, I kind of thought I actually started writing the article and I had this in it and I cut it out. I was astonished at how much I could find out about what was going on with the Soviets. But a lot of those scientists, those fishery scientists, published with other Western scientists. This is kind of once the Soviet Union fell, but they were quite upfront, I thought, about the history of their bid to create this self-sustaining population. And they also said, maybe it wasn't a good idea. So, I think science was foremost for the scientists. I think it was foremost in their mind. And when you think of fishery scientists in Russia, when I was working on my salmon book, I had quite a few email exchanges with them, and it was lovely. They didn't really want to talk on Zoom. I think they were more comfortable with English, written English, and they were quite upfront. And for this article, I tried really hard to contact some of the names on those papers, and I couldn't get through at all. I tried a bunch of different venues. But, Norway and Russia, they cooperate on the cod fishery quite closely, and they still do. And I think that's, to the scientists' credit.
It is very difficult, right? When a situation like that breaks out, yeah. So how did that happen? That those salmon ended up in Norway?
So the Soviets were wildly successful with the White Sea, even though they still do have Atlantic salmon rivers there, but they did create some very healthy runs in the White Sea, from what I understand. And I'm getting that from a Norwegian scientist who spent time working on his master's in the Kola Peninsula on some of the rivers there, and through some of the papers that I've read and that you find in Google Scholar and different publications. And naturally, the White Sea, empties into the Arctic Ocean. It's a gateway to the Barents Sea, which is off the Norwegian, northeast coast. And pink salmon stray. They are well known for straying. So they will repopulate streams, not their own. They will populate streams not their own if the opportunity presents itself. And, this isn't fair to say, but I've had some salmon scientists say they're like the rats of the ocean. They're just successful, right? They're just adaptable and successful. And straying really helps their movement into new habitat. So they probably followed the food and into the Barents Sea. And, maybe there was more food because there's fewer Atlantic salmon or other fish. I'm not really sure. I don't think people really know, except to say that there's something there for them to eat. They are successful. And then when it comes time to spawn, they've got to find a river. So, and Norway, that area of Norway and Finnmark has a lot of rivers, right? They're not dammed or anything. They're these free flowing. Some of them are big. A lot of them are not that big, but there's a lot. And that's what makes Norway special for fishermen, right? Is that they have so many rivers to choose from in terms of fishing. So it was inevitable that pink salmon would land themselves in Finnmark. And the first one was actually spotted in 1960. So they've had these pinks for a very long time. They were just a nuisance. They didn't overwhelm the ecosystem, at least not in their mind. So I kind of think Norway was maybe a little complacent, but a lot of countries are complacent when it comes to that, right? Like it wasn't really a big deal until climate change really kind of reared its ugly head.
Ah, right. I was actually forgot to ask you earlier, why pink salmon rather than Atlantic salmon? Like, what are the benefits of bringing pink salmon over Atlantic salmon? I mean, for these Soviet scientists, are they growing quicker, or like what's the story?
Yeah, they grow. Pink salmon are very successful hatchery fish. They have a 2-year life cycle. You can let them go fairly soon into the environment, get their biomass out in the ocean, and then they come back. They're not huge. They're the smallest of the Pacific salmon, but Alaska sends out so many hatchery pink. It's amazing. And I actually just got a email from a hatchery manager on the northern coast of BC, and he asked me about if Atlantic salmon eat pink salmon fry in the rivers. And it's a part I actually cut out of the article because I just had only so much room and I wanted to keep people's attention. But I was glad he asked me that. And why he asked me that was because they have a pink hatchery where he is, because they see it as the base of a food chain for the bigger salmon, for Chinook and coho and stuff like that, and fry. And I honestly had never heard that, even though I've written about salmon, I've written about pink salmon. And I thought, I like, obviously I knew that other fish eat other fish eggs and stuff like that, but I never thought of it as the base of a food chain for the for the 5 species of salmon or Pacific salmon. And the only thing I could tell him was, from what I understood from the research I've seen, is that Atlantic salmon do eat pink salmon eggs. So do brown trout, and so do flounder, actually. But the pink salmon in turn actually eat midge larvae and mayfly larvae, which is what the Atlantic salmon eat. So in any case, why pink salmon? They're a good bet.
Gotcha. And you mentioned like some countries are complacent, like for listeners, like we have like Ireland, Inland Fisheries Ireland have an announcement because pink salmon starts showing up in Ireland as well. And obviously, like always in those cases, like, hey, report that, don't release that fish. And, so I don't know how many listeners heard about that, but it's not entirely what we're talking about. It's not entirely disconnected from the realities of what's going on in Ireland, because they are showing up in Ireland as well, and I presume also in the UK rivers and so on, in Scotland.
They are. They're showing up in Scotland, and they're also showing up in Newfoundland.
Oh,
in Canada.
Wow.
So there's another article I'm actually going to write, because I could have gone 2 ways with this article. It was like this ecological change in Norway, which I find always fascinating. And then you have to decide as a population, or a community, how am I going to deal with this? Because there's no way you're going to get rid of all these fish, right? What does this mean for us? But the other part of it, and that's the article and follow-up article I'm going to do, is Norway is kind of the bulwark, the vanguard. They are Canada and I think the UK have come on board in this past June, talking to Norwegian officials, going, okay, you've got to stop this, and we want to help you. So there is this feeling that what goes on in Norway is going to determine what happens to the North Atlantic as a whole, right? So that will be another article I do, and it's this particular river I visited, which again didn't make it into this article I wrote. It's called the Tana River, and it's a very big river, and it flows from Finland through Norway to the Barents. And the Finns are just kind of freaked out by what's happening there. They had a huge fence across it, and the researcher I talked to said that fence was a bust. It's not worth it. And but in any case, Finland doesn't want pinks in the Baltic, right? These countries are a little freaked out.
This is so interesting. And so it was in 2017, 2016 when there was like not one or twos of those pink salmon. Then they just start showing up in numbers. Can you tell us about that? Like what happened that all of a sudden? Well, you kind of like preempted that already with climate change. Like usually all those changes are climate change. But any more details on that? What people are doing, like, because they try to eradicate them as well. When it's so, if you can just give us a little bit more details around that, what happened around the time when they start showing up in numbers, like huge numbers.
So there were favorable ocean conditions, right? Courtesy climate change. That probably means there was just a lot of food for pinks. And they ended up, one river had 8 in 2015, and they ended up with thousands in 2017. So it was a huge change. This freaked people out. I don't think at that moment they were doing a whole lot, right? They were flabbergasted by what happened. What they did was they were worried, I think probably about contamination from the pink salmon carcasses that were found. It's not like it is here in BC where there is like, they just litter a stream, but there was enough to make community people concerned. And there's a lot of hunting and fishing associations there, and they're very integral to that ecosystem in terms of caring for it, right? You get this idea that the local people are very committed to their rivers and streams and ecosystem. They're hunters, they're fishers, that kind of thing. So they organized themselves into groups to clean the carcasses out of these rivers. And by then, they're debating what to do, talking to different government officials and stuff like that. 2019 comes along, there's even more. And now everyone's like, oh, geez. And I'm trying to remember when the first traps started. They were definitely up in 2021. They might have been up in 2019 as well. Some of the hunting and fishing associations got together and decided, okay, we've got to do something here. And eventually, the Norwegian government kicked in funds in 2021, 2023, and lent some government officials to help organize and that kind of thing. And so these organizations, in 2023, there was seasonal help, people who were hired at the traps, because before it was volunteer work. They were gathering the fish. It was going to sled dog owners to feed their dogs, but there was too many fish and then not enough dogs. So it was more ad hoc. So it was a bit more organized, I believe, from what I could tell in 2023 and from chatting with some of the officials. And people were hired for a few weeks in June, July, part of August. And depending on the river, the trap, it might be a weir, it might be a trap. They might just be netting. But you would have a team of people come. And part of the whole thing, too, with Norway is they have rules. And those rules are you've got to do it humanely, quickly. And let's try not to, even though they don't want a self-sustaining pink salmon fishery, they didn't want to necessarily waste the food. So there were a couple of fish processing companies who came in and processed the fish. I don't know how successful they were at flogging that fish to consumers. I mean, I think sled dog owners probably got some too, but very organized, humanely whack, kill, done, get into a barrel with ice and off you go to the fish processing plant. So I think it was well organized and effective, for particular streams, not perfect by any means, but definitely a lot of work, a lot of focus. So, it was, I've never seen like this one river, the Niden. It was the first one we saw. And I couldn't believe the amount of pink salmon coming in, and they were coming up a fish ladder and they were grabbing them, hitting, conking them. They were dead in an instant and they were packaged or put into the ice-filled barrels. And it was just, like I said, 450 fish in an hour. Because I said, maybe just process and put in these barrels. And you count the barrels and how many fish per barrel. So it was fascinating.
And obviously, so that was like initial response, right, from the Norwegian government. They invested a lot of money into the program of eradication and trying to clean up things, right? And I presume I'm getting it was a little bit too late because they started doing that when there was thousands of the fish, not 8.
What people don't know too is that there's also a bag net fishery in the bays and the fjords and stuff, and they caught 100,000 fish in 2023.
Wow.
Yeah. So there was also that going on, and that didn't make it into my article, but
I'm so glad we're getting all those extra things that people can learn, and definitely you should read the article. The article will be linked in the show notes. So, what's how successful was the program of eradication?
Well, if you talk to some of the government officials, it was good enough. For them, they want to control the pink salmon. They're not going to eradicate them. They know that. So for most of the rivers where I was in Varanger Fjord, I think the 5 million euros spent, not just in Finnmark, but elsewhere, but still that money spent, I think the idea is that it's well spent and they're going to keep doing it. They're just not going to give up. They're going to continue to try to control the pink salmon population. Again, with support from other countries in the North Atlantic that are worried about that. The thing is, pinks are a food source. They are delicious. And I would have to say that the pinks I had in Norway were more delicious than the pinks I've had on the BC coast. They were plumper, richer, just shinier. And I had this again, didn't quite make it into the article. I did mention I had some sashimi prepared by a Thai fly fisher who caught his first salmon, and it was a Pacific salmon, not an Atlantic salmon, which he came from Thailand to get, right? An Atlantic salmon. It was delicious. But then I also had a salmon patty at one of these little concessions that they have along their fishing rivers, and that's open in the summer. And it was delicious. It wasn't fishy at all. It was lovely. And when I asked the people at the concession about this pink salmon and selling it, he said, well, it's just a cheap fish, so I can make this great patty and sell it at a good price, right? They didn't pay a lot for it. And then I was at this Italian restaurant at Varangerbotten. They were from Italy. And I had the lunch special, which was linguine with a pink salmon cream sauce. It was fabulous. It was really good. And I actually talked to the cook, to the chef. And I said, this was lovely. How did you, it's not fishy at all. And my experience with pink has been a little fishy. And he said, well, I cut it with brandy. And I don't know if it's because he cut it with brandy or just it was an incredibly fresh fish. And I said, did you buy, who supplied you the fish? He goes, well, our supplier, he gave it to them, gifted it to them, right? Like, see if you can do something with this. But a lot of the scientists I interviewed, they fish. And they fish for pinks, and they process the fish and they have it all winter.
Is there any exit strategy, or are they going to be locked into controlling numbers situation forever and ever until they cannot control? Because, like, obviously this is a topic we talk about on the podcast quite often about, predator control, and especially in the ecosystems that are, depleted or suboptimal. Which is not, I'm not saying that one is such, but it seems like, is there an exit strategy, or is it like, we're going to be controlling those pink salmon forever?
I asked this one scientist who is on one of the rivers there working, and he's been on that river for a number of seasons, and he's a fly fisherman too. And I said, what will you be doing in 2029? He said, well, I hope not this. And, he goes, I hope I have a real job, because he's doing his graduate work in fisheries. But still, he from that area, fishes that area. And I think they know they're in it. They have to be in it for the long haul. And if they're not in it for the long haul, then, the pinks will create a new habitat for themselves. Although we have to also keep in mind is we can't predict the future, and we don't know if there's something that naturally occurring that would stop the pinks, right? I had some people, one scientist thought that the populations might be crashing in the Kola in the 2023, 2020. I don't know if that's true, but it's hard. Like I said, it's been hard to get that information, but it would be interesting to know what's going on in the Kola right now, because I think they were at pretty high numbers up until recently. So there's something that could happen with climate change related that isn't good for the pink salmon either. They're very thermal tolerant compared to other Pacific salmon, but every animal has its limit.
So the numbers that are there, because that's not the habitat that they're supposed to be, right? They're invasive species. Is the numbers that are present higher than would be naturally occurring in their habitat, or is it roughly the same?
They're not as. It's funny because a lot of the scientists said, "What does it look like in BC rivers with pinks?" They're not at the same numbers. No, I mean, when you see a huge, healthy pink run in BC and Alaska, Washington State, the Pacific Northwest, it's just there's nothing like it. It's mind-boggling, right? There's millions of fish. So here they're just looking at thousands, and some of those streams and rivers that I was at are on the smaller side, so they could only their adaptive their capacity is only so much anyway. Somewhere like the Tanner River is really big. That's a big river. That would have, if pinks made that into their habitat, that could be a huge run for sure. Yeah. And the Grunts is pretty big. Like that could be, there was hundreds. Well, there were thousands there when I was there. Gregor, who was counting, that day, he counted thousands, and he counted so many reds, so many nests, and he counted hardly any Atlantics.
And speaking about Atlantic salmon, they are in precarious situation, as far as I can tell. So I presume that can't be good for Atlantic salmon. Can you tell us, like, what are your thoughts? It's like, well, it's like really, not specific question. It's more like an open question, because I am wondering, on one hand, is Atlantic salmon as good as done, given climate change, pink salmon showing up, everything else that's going on? Yeah, is there a hope?
I don't know as much about Atlantic salmon as I do about Pacific. And I do know Pacific are an incredibly adaptive, resilient species. And I kind of think salmonids in general are, brown trout, and probably Atlantic salmon as well. So I never, you never say never. Like, we just don't know. We don't have a crystal ball. There are some strongholds for Atlantic salmon for sure. And they have been battered by, development, industrialization, climate change as well. So they're one of many species that I don't know that I'd say they're on the ropes, but maybe need a helping hand, right? In terms of maybe we shouldn't fish for them in certain places. Maybe it should be catch and release, which is a whole other can of worms, catch and release. But people love that fish. And I know there's a lot of efforts to keep populations as healthy as possible. So, and I don't know that we can say pinks will be the end of Atlantic. I don't think that's necessarily true. They could very well, and this is one of the things the Russian scientists said in some of their earlier papers, was it could be that pinks fill a different niche. In some ways, they do eat some of the same food coming out of the nest as they're heading to the barrens, but mostly pinks feed on their yolk sac before, on the way to the ocean. They don't necessarily usurp some of that food that Atlantic salmon are looking for. Maybe some do, but not all. Probably depends on the stream. So, yeah, I think with continued efforts, the Atlantics have a chance for sure. But I think we have to knowingly think of how to keep populations healthy. And that's keeping habitats healthy. So even if you have a habitat that's healthy for pink salmon, it's healthy for Atlantic salmon.
The question is whether the pink salmon makes that habitat uninhabitable or unhealthy for Atlantic salmon, right? It was I think in the piece was the part where you said that they were more aggressive in Norway towards other fish.
Yeah, but that's also when the water's low, right? So when the water's high, they're fine. It's when the water's, I'm trying to remember what Paul said, under a certain level, then they get kind of bitey and aggressive, which would scare Atlantic salmon. This is his eyewitness account, right? So there's nothing scientific, no, not necessarily evidence-based, although this is a scientist who watches a lot of fish, so what he says is worth listening to. But yeah, he said it looked like the Atlantics got a little scared of the behavior of pinks, and the ecology of fear is a whole other study of, in scientific literature. And we know that fear changes animals' behaviors. So there is that. But again, it comes down to the water levels. There was also, like Gregor was saying, that the pink salmon might create better habitat for Atlantic salmon as well, and other salmonid.
How so?
When they dig their reds, so somewhere like the Tana River, which when I've circled that, it was ahead of it. I didn't see, I think maybe I saw one fish. And I think I saw a wine bottle and a beer can. And the bottom of the river was very sandy, just kind of barren in a way. And I'm not sure Gregor was talking about the Tana or some other rivers, but he said in some places where it hasn't been a huge Atlantic salmon population where it's declined, then the river becomes almost like concrete in a way, the riverbed. And because you don't have those fish digging up the bottom for their nests, for their reds. And he and his partner have snorkeled, and they've seen the pink salmon churn up that bottom. They're very good diggers. And what they do is they recreate the salmon habitat that the Atlantic salmon are used to. So they think that that kind of behavior actually helps out the Atlantic salmon. that's not all streams. Some streams are very rocky, and the pink salmon are a threat to freshwater mussels, actually, in those cases, because they're digging up these rocks and stuff. And it's amazing the size of the rock they can move with their digging. And that's not good for freshwater mussels. But in these other streams, it might actually be good for Atlantics.
Wow, that's very interesting. Is there a lot of scientific research going on right now on this particular issue? And is there, I would imagine there's a lot of potential for scientific research
on how pinks are affecting Atlantics?
Yeah,
or
how they're interacting with the environment and how they're changing the environment and all those things.
Honestly, what I've put in the article, there's probably new papers these past few months, and I kind of have an alert and I'm looking. So there's been more about the food web. There's a Finnish scientist who does a lot on the food web and what they eat, what pinks eat, what Atlantics eat, that kind of thing. So I'm pretty sure what I have is kind of the latest.
Yeah, but I mean, like, is there opportunity, like, for scientists to, who are interested in that, to because I suppose my question is, like, how hungry is the science for more research and more scientists who are willing to go and validate those, observations?
I think there's a lot there. Absolutely. There's all hands on deck to a certain extent. I know in 2021, a researcher from Alaska was there with Kathy Dunlop and her group, looking at the different salmon streams and what was happening there, and giving his opinion on, being a Pacific salmon expert about what was happening and what they might expect, or, how it might be different from their native habitat. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity for sure. And I think there's lots of graduate students working on a lot of different papers. So I listened to a master's thesis defense, and it was about whether pink salmon were with their carcasses. That's a question the Russian scientists had years ago in some of their papers. Do the pink salmon carcasses leak some kind of toxic bacteria or whatever? Do they somehow impact the health of the water in different rivers and streams? So that's there. And I listened to hers, and she actually was inconclusive in her findings. And I went out with another PhD candidate who was looking at, along the lines of what Kathy Dunlop was looking at, but in Finland, about how the salmon carcasses feed the riverbanks or, inland from there. But they have a lot to draw on, because researchers in Canada have done a lot of that research before, right? The salmon trees whole issue came, that was first brought to light in, I think, the 1990s by marine ecologists. And I was out in the field, actually, with one of them whose theory that was. So they have a lot to draw on, and they know what to look for, right? So I think a lot of graduate students are on board, and they've got some great projects to work on.
I would imagine, because it's like a real life experiment, like a real life laboratory to see what's going on. Okay, Jude, listen, let's just now roll up into the sort of conclusion, but also in a way most interesting aspect of it. It seems to me we had an episode about novel ecosystems. It's episode 184 for people interested. Is this what we're observing there, sort of like a novel ecosystem that is being created? And because the feeling I've got is that usually, and that was like an initial move by Norwegian government, is like, oh, I don't know, because you said, like, we're not going to eradicate them, but if we can, let's eradicate them. I spoke about, for example, sika deer in Ireland, where there's a lot of ecologists who would, like, gladly eradicate every single one of them to have a ecosystem pure and how it's supposed to be. And then I spoke with the scientists about this concept of novel ecosystems, which is essentially, look, ecosystems are never stable. They're always changing. And maybe we as humans are, helping those species to move around a little bit more than they would otherwise. But then at some point, they're creating this novel ecosystem. Now, I also, and this is also from episode 984, is that we got to be careful with that, because sometimes those changes are, without a doubt bad, but then the policymakers can go, aha, novel ecosystem, right? It's all good. So I'm curious your comments on this, like how much, because it seems from what we spoke here is that pink salmon is there to stay. How does it look like this novel ecosystem? Is it all bad? Because again, I hear like, oh, people are eating them and they're quite good and they're cheap and there's a lot of them and they might have not only bad impacts on it. So how that situation, if you just step back and right, they're invasive species, those exist, but overall, like how does it look for you? Is it like, are we dealing with effectively a novel ecosystem which is interesting and not necessarily bad? Or is it part of you that, if you had a time machine, you would sort out that problem of pink salmon?
That is a really good question. And I think we have to think about pink salmon too, as humans have helped them, absolutely. But, they're, again, Pacific salmon are resilient, they're adaptive, and pinks are really, really resilient, really adept. Like I said, they've got their thermal tolerance is pretty good compared to the others, their other cousins. So they've gone from the Pacific up to the Arctic, and they're moving anyway, regardless of what we do because of climate change. Well, I guess we did climate change, but in any case, they will, life wins. Like they seek life. That's what they do. And yes, the Russians brought them from the Pacific to the Kola Peninsula and they strayed. I don't really believe in time machines because you can never, like, again, I always say you can't really predict the future. You can imagine the future and use your knowledge to, put forth some kind of hypothesis or theory, but that's all it ever is. So I think, pink salmon, they're there to stay and you can control them, but they have made a home and they are part of the ecosystem. The thing is, in Norway, in that area of Norway, there's another example of that. There's I think it's the king crab, which also came from Russia, which Russians also brought from one place to another, and they came into Norway. And the Norwegians, and it was a big deal because these crabs, they just totally changed the ecosystem of the ocean floor or the Barents Sea there. But you know what? Nobody did anything, and they became an incredibly lucrative fishery. It is a very important fishery now, king crabs. And now their numbers are starting to crash, and people are getting worried about it. So there is a case of this is a novel ecosystem, they let it go, and it's a lucrative, regulated fishery. The Norwegians don't want that to happen with the pink salmon. And I don't know how long they can hold off for, right? So, give it another 10 years, see what happens. But again, Mother Nature has a way of telling us where things are going to go, like our best intentions. So it might be that pinks find another way, or that pinks find a barrier that comes with a changing climate or, something else.
But overall, is there perception that they're a threat to Atlantic salmon?
Yeah, I think overall, I think generally people think that, because if you go to a river, you can take as many pinks as you want, right? And there's you can just fish for them, take them, please go. But for Atlantics and stuff, that's all more regulated, and where you can fish for them, how many you can take, all that kind of thing. One of the best rivers that the King of Norway fishes on, the Alta River, which still has a good Atlantic salmon run, you have to win a lottery to fish it. So people are so invested in their identity with Atlantic salmon that, anything that they see that might usurp that, they'll see as a threat. So I think your average person is going to think that. But I think a lot of scientists, though, are like, let's see. And two of the scientists I was in the field with, they said, this would be really, actually three, separately said this, it would be, because they're job was to try to control and stop them. But each of them said, I kind of wish I could just study it because this is a really interesting scientific event going on, an ecological change that would be fun to just track and understand and just keep an open mind about. So I have all these scientists who are doing that. They're just like, okay, I'm not going to go in there with a preconceived notion. Let's see what's happening. And that's like Kathy Dunlap and some of the people she works with. It's like, let's just, before we make these grand statements, let's see what happens. And I think she's right. It's going to depend on the stream and it's going to depend on the year and the conditions and all that kind of stuff. And then there's other people who are, on board with this is a threat. But I don't know that they're right.
Interesting.
They're probably right in certain circumstances.
I can imagine that some people were listening to that and they not gonna be happy about that, what they hear now. And I'm gonna follow up on with the question. So do you think that those pink salmon showing up in Irish rivers and the Scottish River, should we be open-minded about them as well and not necessarily do like such a big deal of that? Or do you think that because they're just showing up is like, well, don't go there. Just get rid of them while you can.
So I don't live there.
Yeah, I know. But I had to ask that, right?
I know. And people are very attached to their landscape. But as you mentioned, landscapes are very dynamic. Seascapes are dynamic. But we know a landscape from our own lifetime, which is a very, very, very short amount of time. And if like in Finnmark, if people feel it's a threat and they think they can do something about it, and like I said, they try to use that. They're eating these fish. It's not like they're just, they're not totally wasted, which is good. I think if that's something you want to do for however long that you think you can keep it up, go ahead. But I think eventually it's something we'll give. And it might not be pink salmon. It might be another fish. It might be another species. So, and we have to keep in mind as well, Atlantic salmon in Norway and Finnmark, at the beginning of the Holocene, when the glaciers are starting to recede, water is starting to flow, you see Atlantic salmon start moving north, right? It's an ecological change. And people followed them because fish means power. Fish means food. Fish, you follow the fish. So we have done that before and things have changed before and they'll change again. The thing is they change so quickly now and not everybody or everything can adapt. And that's the scary thing, right? So if Irish people want to protect their streams from Atlantic, if they have good Atlantic runs, well, go ahead, but you will be doing it for a long time.
Overall, after you've been there for 3 weeks writing this article, has what you witnessed there changed your views on pink salmon, on invasive species, on efforts to eradicate them?
I think like a lot of people, and this isn't just that trip, but over the years, I've come to the conclusion we're worrywarts and we fret a lot. And there's a reason to do that. Environmentally, things are not, can be not very hopeful. But, being there, I think, particularly in Finnmark, really cemented for me that people care about their environment. They care about the creatures that surround them. They care about their seascapes, their landscapes. And sometimes that's just enough. Do you know what I mean? That sense of hope and something you hold dear. And maybe this isn't an animal you wanted. And it might end up being the animal you have or the nature you have, right? And isn't that the most important thing? In a way, is that these landscapes and seascapes stay natural and maybe not the way we imagine them to be, but maybe they're healthy for other organisms, right? And they remain healthy for us. So I kind of thought when I was in that little tent along the Grense Jakobselv that this was a pretty special part of the world and there are other special parts of the world. where there's lots of life. There's people who appreciate that nature. There's people who care so deeply. And that, to me, is the most important thing.
Folks listening to that, just remember you can always subscribe to my newsletter. The link is as well as links to the articles in the show notes. Jude, to wrap this up, you come across as massively optimistic person. So I gotta ask that question that I usually ask at the end of the episodes. What are your predictions for the future of the natural world, and specifically coastal landscape, coastal ecosystems, marine ecosystems? If you look into your crystal ball, what do you see in the time frame of, 10, 30, 50, 100 years?
I spend a lot of time chatting with scientists who work so hard on things like marine protected areas, on, fish populations, any kind of protected area. I see so many of them. And then you find out that their tentacles are wide, are long, and they reach, and they have the ears of people we wouldn't think they do, right? So I'll give you an example. Jane Luchemkov, the bench. I can't remember Jane's last name now. She's awesome. She was the head of the of NOAA for the U.S. under the Obama administration, and people like her are in these positions, have been in these positions of power, who have had tremendous influence. And I just think if people keep the pressure up, that we will save more of the natural world, which is incredibly. Once you give it a chance, it's prolific, it's dynamic, it's giving. It's like, again, life seeks a place to be. And I just think that when I know those people are out there, and I know they're putting the pressure on, and they just have to keep doing it, and we have to support them. And how to support them is reading about their work, right? Supporting their work. And I'm going to say supporting environmental journalism, because that's an important part of the solution, is to know what's going on and then choose. The Jane Goodall I chatted with once, Jane Goodall said, choose one thing. You can't save the world. Choose the thing you care about. And if everybody chooses the thing they care about, then change happens, and change will happen in 10 years.
Very smart, very wise words, Jude. It was absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. I love talking about fish.